Welcome, everybody. Hope you're having a great weekend so far, and it's so good to have you here today. I can't think of a better way to end one week and begin another week than to be right here with you as we explore the truth about the heart of God toward us and the big issues of life. And no matter which campus you happen to be attending today, our prayer is the same for you, that God would just speak to you in a personal way, in a powerful way, no matter where it is you happen to be hearing this message right now. Over the last few weeks, we've been working our way through the story of a guy in the Bible by the name of Joseph. His story is told in the book of Genesis, the very first book in the Bible. And Joseph was a very, very ordinary guy. He really was. And yet, if you know his story, you know that he lived an extraordinary life. And there was one thing that allowed such an ordinary guy to live such an extraordinary story. And the secret to his life was this. The one thing that set him apart was this, not original with me. I heard this years ago, but it's a great summary of the story of Joseph. Joseph did what any ordinary person would do who is confident that God is with him. He just did what any ordinary person would do who is confident that God is with him. In the good times and the hard times, in the peaks and in the valleys, he just kept doing what any ordinary person would do who is confident that God is with him. And today, we're going to see how Joseph goes from extreme adversity to extreme prosperity. Literally in a matter of hours, he goes from rags to riches. He wakes up one morning in a prison. By the end of that day, he goes to bed at night in a palace. It's an amazing part of his story, and for some of you here today, this may be the message in this series that really resonates with you. Because if you're honest and you step back and take a look at your life, you would have to say that your life has really, really been blessed. That you've been given some incredible opportunities. You're living a more comfortable life than really most people in this world will ever experience. And I want you to think about this today, that you did not get there alone. Some of you are younger. You're just beginning your career, you're just beginning your adult life, but you're on a trajectory also that may someday put you in a position where you will be more successful than you ever imagined you could be. And here's what I want us to understand today. That God's blessing on our lives is a wonderful thing. That it's a great thing to be able to enjoy the comfort and the prosperity and the opportunities that we enjoy as Americans. But there is a dark side to success. There is a dark side to comfort and prosperity. Listen to these words from Proverbs chapter 30. The writer of Proverbs says this, "Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise I may have too much and disown you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or I may become poor and steal and so dishonor the name of my God." But do you see that phrase in the middle there? I may have too much and disown you and say, "Who is the Lord?" See, here's the reality. When life is going really well, when your life is smooth and comfortable and wrinkle-free, those are the times when we drift away from God. And I think that prosperity, quite honestly, is a greater threat to our faith for most of us than adversity ever could be. In fact, think about this. In hospitals, we have chaplains. In the armed services, we have chaplains, but there's no such thing as a chaplain at a country club or a cocktail hour or a resort hotel. And here's the reason. When we're going through those times of struggle and uncertainty and pain, that's when we are driven toward the heart of God. But when everything is going pretty well for us, that's when we drift away from God. And I think prosperity is oftentimes much harder on our faith than adversity ever could be. And today we're going to see in the life of Joseph how he was able to navigate extreme success, extreme prosperity, and yet still walk closely with God, because Joseph was just an ordinary guy who did what any ordinary person would do, who's confident that God is with him. So if you have a Bible, turn to Genesis. Today we're in chapter 41. You can also take that note sheet out of your bulletin, and that's a real handy way to follow along and write some things down that you may want to remember. And let me just remind you again, as I do most weeks, on the inside are the app notes that we encourage you to take advantage of when you leave here. Continue the learning at home. For the sake of those who haven't been here for a couple of weeks, let me do a little bit of review. 3 weeks ago, we talked about the fact that Joseph grew up in a dysfunctional family with a capital D. Like, his brothers hated him so much, they literally wanted to kill him, and the only thing that stopped them from killing him is that an opportunity came along to sell him into slavery. So Joseph, at the age of 17, gets sold into slavery and he's taken to Egypt. He winds up in the household of a man named Potiphar. And many of us at that point would just want to give up. We'd be so discouraged. But do you know what Joseph did there as a slave in the household of Potiphar? He did what any ordinary guy would do who was confident that God was with him. He made the best of a bad situation. He worked hard. He honored his boss. He lived with integrity. And eventually, Joseph became the most successful slave in Egypt. And then after a while there in Potiphar's household, Joseph was falsely accused of rape and thrown into jail. And again, that'd be a point at which most of us would just want to give up on life, give up on God. But do you know what Joseph did there in prison? He did what any ordinary person would do who is confident that God is with him. And he made the best of a bad situation. And he worked hard, and he honored the authority in his life. And he lived with integrity. And eventually, Joseph became the most successful prisoner in Egypt. But it was while he was there in prison that he crossed paths with two men who were part of the king's inner circle, the king's cupbearer and the king's baker. And these two men had two different dreams one night, and Joseph was able to interpret their dreams. And sure enough, 3 days later, those dreams were fulfilled exactly as Joseph had predicted. The baker was put to death, the cupbearer was reinstated in service to the king. But before he left the prison, the cupbearer promised Joseph that he would plead Joseph's case before the king once he saw the king again. And here's where we ended last week, chapter 40 and verse 23. It says this: "The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him." And by the way, one of the women on our staff said that if the cupbearer had been a woman, she would not have forgotten Joseph. Probably true. Today we come to chapter 41. And we're going to pick up the story there. And we got to cover a lot of ground in the book of Genesis. So a lot of what I'm going to do is just read the story and we'll comment on it as we go. So chapter 41, verse 1, when 2 full years had passed, like 2 more years go by in jail. And again, for most of us, we would have just given up on God at that point. Not Joseph. Here's what happens. Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. Now, you have to understand that dreams were very important in the Egyptian culture. The Egyptians believed that when you were sleeping, the gods drew near to you, and that dreams were their messages from the spirit world to the human world. And so what God does is he leverages this belief, and he uses the language of dreams to speak to the mind and heart of this unbelieving king, Pharaoh. He wakes up the next morning distraught, troubled. He is desperate to find out the meaning of these dreams. Verse 8, in the morning his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. So he calls in all the psychics and the fortune tellers, and he gets David Blaine, and he gets Oprah, and he gets everybody he can think of. But nobody could interpret those dreams for him. And so the cupbearer decides that this might be the perfect opportunity to tell the king about his old friend Joseph. Because the cupbearer is a political animal too, and so he figures, you know what? This is the opportune moment. I can score a few points with the king, maybe find the solution to his problem and win his favor. So verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Today I am reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard." You remember that, don't you, Pharaoh? I mean, no hard feelings. It was 2 years ago and all, but just you remember that, don't you? Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh hears this information and he figures, you know what? It's a long shot. Hebrew servant in prison. I doubt he can help me, but you know what? I've got nothing to lose, so I'm going to give it a try. So verse 14, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, you can imagine what he looked like and smelled like after years in prison. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Okay, now remember this. Joseph is now standing before the most powerful man in the world at that time. Verse 15. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Just stop right there. Put yourself in this situation. Imagine this. You've been either a slave or a prisoner for the last 13 years of your life. You lost your entire decade of your 20s. You are now standing before the one man in the world that has the power to set you free. The most powerful man in the world has a problem, and you know that you have the solution. This, my friends, is what we call the opportunity of a lifetime. How do you respond in this moment? How does Joseph respond in this moment? Because think about it, Joseph could have responded in any number of different ways. He could have said, yeah, it's true. I mean, I have this unique for interpreting dreams. In fact, my track record is 100% accurate. And Mr. Pharaoh, today is your lucky day because I happen to have an opening in my schedule today for you. I'm your guy. Could have said that. Or he could have said this. He could have said, yeah, it's true. I can interpret dreams. Let's see if we can make a little arrangement here. I'll tell you what. You get me out of prison. You give me a 6-figure settlement for my pain and suffering. And you offer to pay all future costs for therapy. And I'll interpret your dream. Joseph doesn't do that. He doesn't negotiate. Doesn't try to promote himself. I mean, for the first time in his life, he's got some leverage. He doesn't use it. Listen to what he says. Verse 16. I cannot do it. You're standing before the one guy who has the power to set you free. And Joseph says, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. And let me tell you what's so amazing about this. Joseph could have entirely left the God part out of it. He could have just said, yes, tell me your dream. Let me see what I can do for you. He didn't have to mention his faith. He didn't have to mention God. The God, by the way, who had let him sit in prison for years and let him be a slave for years. It's amazing that he shifts the spotlight off of himself to his God, the one true God. And this is so counter to what is natural for most of us as human beings, because inside of us, there's this natural tendency as prideful and insecure human beings for us to just make ourselves look really good all the time, to focus the attention on ourselves. I mean, think of this. Have you ever had a group picture or a group photo that you were in? And you see that group photo for the first time? Who's the first person you look for? Yourself, that's right. And if you look good in that picture, then it's a good picture. But if you look, it doesn't matter how everybody else looks, but if you look at that picture and everybody else in the picture looks good, but you look kind of bad, what kind of picture is that? On every campus, that is a bad picture. Yeah, because deep down inside, all of us by nature are prideful and insecure, and we always want to make ourselves look good. And the amazing thing here about Joseph is that he doesn't take this opportunity to make himself look better. He's more concerned not with making Joseph look good, but with making God look good. Now, listen to what he says next. I'll keep reading. He goes from interpreting dreams to, he goes into now interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh. Verse 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed, underline that, God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh, underline that, what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in two forms is that the matter has been firmly, listen to this, decided by God, and God will do it. I mean, all the way through this interpretation, Joseph just continues pointing to God. God has revealed, God has shown, God has decided, God will do it soon. And you have to understand something. He was taking a risk in saying this, because in Egyptian culture, the pharaohs were seen as gods. Egyptian people believed that the pharaohs would continue to lead them in the afterlife. That's why their tombs were so elaborate. And so Joseph is standing before a man who thinks he's God and proclaiming the one true God. Now, this is so fascinating to me because here's what we often do. You know, when you're on your way up, when you've got a chance to advance your career, when you've got a chance to improve your financial situation, here's what we often do. We kind of hide our faith. We kind of push God off to the side. We maybe compromise our convictions, and we say, you know, God, you stay over there in church, because this is business. This is like economics. This is real life. But Joseph doesn't do that. Even when, with so much at stake, he just keeps pointing everyone's attention back to God. Now, notice what happens next. He goes from interpreting the dream to giving advice. Verse 33. And now, let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Oh, if we could only have politicians like this today. Anyway, that's a different subject. Go back to verse 33. I want to look closely at verse 33. Here's what Joseph doesn't say. He doesn't say, and now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man who can take charge of the land of Egypt. He doesn't say, and by the way, I'm your guy. Because like me and God, we've got a good thing going. He and I are a team. And, you know, I did interpret the dream story. I did come up with a plan. So, you know, I think I should be the one to fill this position. No self-promotion at all. And think about this. As far as Joseph knows, he's going to get sent right back to prison with nothing more than a handshake, a thank you, and a clean shave. And with everything at stake, he does not try to use this opportunity to promote himself. He just keeps pointing everyone's attention to God. So let me tell you three things that are an indication that we are living with the confidence that God is with us. Number one is this: when I pursue success for something more than my own praise, or something more than my own recognition, if you want to use that word. Now, success is good, ambition is okay, but when you experience that, do you see it as just something that will draw attention to you, but do you see that as an opportunity to draw attention to the God who has blessed you and allowed you to come to that place? Some of you, if you grew up in church, you may remember the name Corrie ten Boom. She was a survivor of the Holocaust, and she went on to become a best-selling author. The story of her life was turned into a book and then into a movie. And someone asked her one day what she thought of all of this fame that she was experiencing. And she said this. She said, when Jesus rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on the back of a donkey, and everyone was waving palm branches and throwing garments on the road and singing praises, do you think that for one moment it ever entered the head of that donkey that any of that was for him? If I can be the donkey on which Jesus Christ rides in his glory, I give him all the praise and all the honor. I love that. And let me suggest that if you've experienced success in your life, if God has put you into some kind of position of influence, great or small, that maybe he didn't put you into that position of influence simply for your own glory. What would it look like for you in your place of work, in your sphere of influence, in your neighborhood? What would it look like for you when that opportunity comes along to point the attention of people around you to your Heavenly Father? I'll give you an example of this just from this past week. There was a movie that came out last weekend. It's called The Son of God. It's based on the life of Jesus, right from the Gospels. The producer of this movie is a guy named Mark Burnett. And Mark Burnett is one of the most successful TV producers in history. He has created TV shows like Survivor, The Apprentice, Shark Tank, The Voice. He's very, very successful, very, very wealthy. But he and his wife, Roma Downey, decided that they wanted to use their influence, their wealth, they wanted to use their power for something more than just bringing attention to themselves. And so they created this movie. And of course, they've been interviewed a lot in this past week, but in one of their interviews, they said this. Mark Burnett said this. He said, Roma and I have become the very noisy Hollywood Christians, and we're very happy being in that position because it's our faith. This is a faith that millions of people have willingly died for, right? They could have saved themselves if they denied Jesus, but they didn't, inferring that he couldn't either. Now listen, you're not a wealthy movie producer, I know that, but what would it look like in your place of work, in your sphere of influence, in your neighborhood, to live in such a way that you're constantly in your success, in your opportunities, pointing people's attention not to yourself, but to the God who has blessed you? Let me pick up the story. Verse 37. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? In other words, Pharaoh saw in this young man what Potiphar had seen in him, what the jailer had seen in him, a man who was confident that God was with him in every situation. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. I mean, this is crazy. You got to remember, Joseph woke up that morning as a prison inmate. As far as he knew, it was just going to be another ordinary day in jail. But all of that is about to change dramatically. Well, listen to verse 42. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. Now, little explanation. The signet ring was the symbol of the king's authority. It was used to stamp or to seal documents and to carry on transactions in the name of the king. This is like you getting a company credit card with no credit limit. That's what this is. And it goes on to say he dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. So Joseph gets a brand new wardrobe. And we're not talking Kmart. We're talking Saks Fifth Avenue. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command. So Joseph gets a company car. It's a Bentley. And people shouted before him, make way! And thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And then just to make sure that Joseph is accepted by the Egyptian people, that he has credibility with the Egyptian people, he gives Joseph a new name and gives him a new wife. Verse 45, Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphenath-Paneah. He used to be able to sign his name quickly. And gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. I mean, like, this is a good day. Joseph starts the day in prison. By the end of the day, he's dressed in a new wardrobe, wearing the signet ring of the king. He's got a brand new wife, riding around in a nice chariot. And here's the kicker, verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old. I mean, how do you handle that kind of wealth and power and influence at the age of 30 years old? What did Joseph do with all of that? You know what he did? He did what any ordinary person would do who was confident that God was with him. And Joseph started to do what he had already done as a slave in the household of Potiphar. And Joseph started to do what he had already done in the jail. And what he did for the next 14 years was he was faithful, he worked hard, he loved the people of Egypt, he showed integrity, he reflected the glory of God in his world, and he literally saved a nation by doing so. Verse 47, during the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. And then verse 53, the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt, there was food. And there was food because Joseph did not sit back, take it easy, live a life of luxury and privilege. He used the influence and the power and the wealth that he had been given to save the lives of millions of people, and ultimately, as we'll see next week, even to save his own family. Let me tell you the second indication that you're living out your success with the confidence that God is with you. It is this: when I use my success for something more than my own comfort. When I use my success for something more than my own comfort. And this is so countercultural. It really is. Because as Americans, we have been conditioned to believe that my success is because of me and it is for me. That my success is so that I can have a bigger bank account and a nicer house and a better wardrobe and a fancier car. And those things are not necessarily bad, but the mindset of our culture is that my success is all about me. But if you're living with the confidence that God is with you, then you have to begin to ask yourself some hard questions. Like maybe God has something bigger in mind for me than just pursuing the American dream. Maybe God has blessed me the way He has blessed me so that I can make some small difference in this world in the time that He's given to me. You know, maybe God has brought you to a position of influence in our culture or in this community, my friend, for something more than just your own admiration. Maybe it's so that you can point people to the Savior. Maybe God has blessed you with a good job or a prosperous business for something more than just increasing your lifestyle. Maybe He's given you that so that you can bless someone else. Maybe God has allowed you to retire with good health and a steady income for something more than just playing golf. You see, I know that I'm living with the confidence that God is with me when I use my success for something more than my own comfort. That's what Joseph did. He didn't just live a life of privilege and ease. He went about helping other people and saving, as I said, a nation. Now let me go back to a couple of verses that I skipped over because I think there's one more very, very important point that we need to see here, and it really is a summary of how Joseph navigated this great opportunity. Verse 50. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph has 2 little boys, and it's about to tell us what he named his sons. And by the way, these 2 names are not Egyptian names, these are Hebrew names, which tells me that even though he had been through so much difficulty in his life, Joseph had not given up on God, the God of Israel. It goes on to say this: Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, and this is what the name means, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." And I want you to see a 4-word phrase that's part of the meaning behind both of these names. It's this 4-word phrase: God has made me. God has made me. And Joseph wanted to make sure that he would never, ever forget the source of his success. So he chose names for his little boys that would be a constant reminder to him that he didn't get where he was on his own. And so every time he called those boys in for dinner, every time he tucked them into bed at night and said, "Good night, Ephraim, good night, Manasseh," every time he spoke their names, he was reminding himself, God has made me. He never forgot that it was only by the grace of God. Let me tell you the third indication that shows that you're living with the confidence that God is with you. It's this: when I credit my success to something more than my own effort. And my friend, you may someday find yourself in a position of influence, prosperity, or success that you never imagined you would be in. Never forget that you didn't get there on your own. When you get the big break, when you finish your degree, when you get the job, when you buy your first house, when you get married, when that big opportunity comes along, when you get that paycheck that you never ever thought that you would ever get, don't forget where that ultimately comes from. There's an old saying that goes like this: if you see a turtle sitting on a fence post, you know it didn't get there by itself. And see, when we are elevated and in times of success, we have this tendency to think, as Americans especially, that we got there by ourselves. And we become very forgetful. We forget the days of weakness. We forget the times of struggle. We forget the desperate prayers that we prayed that God answered in incredible ways. And I think one of the best things we can do is what Joseph did. We create tangible reminders in our lives of where we were and where God has brought us. It's too late to go back and rename your kids, so you can't do that. But what are those memorials, those symbols in your life that remind you of the fact that God's grace has been poured out upon you? I'll tell you something that I do, a way that I try to live this out. If you were to go in my office, on my bookshelves, I have a number of objects that may seem odd to some people. And I've told you about some of them before, but this is one of the things that I keep on my bookshelf in my office. It's a metal music box in the shape of a little country church. This was given to me many, many years ago by a couple who had been members of the church for decades. They were part of the core group of the church that was here when I started serving here 25 years ago. And they were a tremendous, tremendous encouragement to me. And I keep this on my shelf because it reminds me of those early days. I was 27 years old, I was single, I had no leadership experience at all, and the church was desperate, so it was a perfect match. And I stumbled in and stumbled around. I'll never forget that a couple of years into it, I had to start teaching consistently every weekend. And I had so much anxiety about that literally about every 3 months, I would get physically sick on a Sunday morning to the point of throwing up, just at the thought of having to stand up and speak. Typical Sunday morning, we had 40, 45 people showing up. We didn't have small groups. We were a small group in those days. And I keep this on my shelf as a reminder of everything that God has done in my life and in the life of this church since that time. And I would not call myself successful. In the eyes of our culture, just being a pastor means you're not successful, let's be honest. But I think of all that I've had the privilege to experience and all that we've been able to do together and the difference that we've been able to make, and I have to remind myself, it's not because I'm smart, not because I've made a lot of great decisions, because I've made a ton of really bad ones. And this, if you wind this up, I won't do it now, but if you wind it up, it plays a tune. The tune is Amazing Grace. And that's a reminder to me that it's only by the grace of God that I'm even still here today. What are those reminders in your life that take you back to the times of struggle, the times of difficulty, to help you remember, God has made me? We must never forget. I want to close with some words from Psalm 103. Psalm 103 was written by another great leader in the history of the nation of Israel, King David. And Psalm 103, it was the basis for a song that was written a couple of years ago called 10,000 Reasons. We sing that song around here a lot. We're actually going to sing it here in a minute. But Psalm 103 begins this way. It says, "Praise the Lord, O my soul, all my inmost being, praise his holy name. Praise the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits." And then the rest of the psalm goes on to list all those benefits. But I want you to see the connection here. It says, forget not all his benefits. And when we forget his benefits, then we stop praising him. And when we stop praising him, then we begin to drift from him. Because that's what can happen in those times of success. We become forgetful. And so David says, praise the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. Because wherever you are today, if you've experienced any measure of success or blessing in your life, you and I, we did not get there alone.